The lab where I worked falsified the safety data of a drug that was going to kill cardiac patients. When I reported it, they erased me from the system as if I never existed. But I had everything printed, photographed, and in 3 different locations. There are things you cannot unsee. Once you see them, they stay there. They settle in the place where uncomfortable certainties live, the ones you know are going to change something in your life the moment you decide to do something with them. I saw the data on a Tuesday at 11 at night. I was working late because I was the kind of person who worked late, because the work mattered to me, because I believed that what we were doing in that laboratory mattered in a way that justified the hours. What I saw that night destroyed that belief so completely that nothing of it remained. And what I did with what I saw is the story I want to tell you. My name is Valentina. I am 38 years old. I am a pharmacist specializing in clinical pharmacology and clinical trial data analysis. I have spent 11 years in the pharmaceutical industry, the last 3 in the research and development department of a laboratory called Pharmavents, which developed drugs for cardiovascular and metabolic diseases. It was work I took seriously in a way not everyone understands from the outside. In clinical pharmacology, data is not abstract. It is people. It is the patients who participated in the trials. It is the future patients who are going to take the drug you are developing based on the trust that the data supporting its approval is real and complete and honest. That trust is the implicit contract between the pharmaceutical industry and the people who take its medicines. And it is exactly what someone at Pharmavents had decided to break. The drug was called Cardivex. It was a next-generation antihypertensive that the laboratory had been developing for 6 years, and that was in the final stage of the regulatory approval process. It was the company's most important project, the one that had received the most investment, the one that generated the most expectations both scientifically and financially. I had spent 18 months working on the statistical analysis of the Phase 3 clinical trial data, which is the final stage before the approval application and the one that determines whether the drug is safe and effective for the population it is intended for. My job was to review the data with the technical precision that regulatory bodies like the FDA in the United States and the EMA in Europe require to approve a drug. That precision was what allowed me to see what others had either not seen or had decided not to see. The first number that made me stop was an outlier in the serious adverse cardiovascular events data. In clinical trials, adverse events are the complications or side effects experienced by participants during the study. They are recorded in detail, classified by severity, and statistically analyzed to determine whether the drug is causing harm. The outlier I found was a discrepancy between the number of serious adverse cardiovascular events reported in the official trial database and the number appearing in the records of the participating clinical centers that I could consult as part of my verification responsibilities. The difference was 16 events. 16 serious adverse cardiovascular events that were in the clinical center records but did not appear in the official trial database. 16 patients who had experienced serious cardiac complications during the trial whose complications had disappeared from the official data. I told myself it could be a data reconciliation error. It happens. Clinical trials involve enormous volumes of data from multiple centers, and transfer and reconciliation errors are a known reality of the process. But reconciliation errors have no direction. Random errors go both ways. Sometimes data appears that should not be there. Sometimes data disappears that should be there. Statistically, they distribute relatively uniformly. These 16 events all went in the same direction. All were serious adverse events. All had disappeared from the official database. That is not a reconciliation error. That is a selection. I spent the following 4 days verifying each of the 16 cases individually. I accessed the records of the participating clinical centers. I verified the medical histories of the affected participants in the systems I had legitimate access to as a member of the analysis team. I cross-referenced the data with the reports from the investigators at each center. What I found at the end of that verification was worse than the initial discrepancy. The 16 events were not random distribution across all trial participants. They were concentrated significantly in a specific subgroup, participants with a prior history of coronary artery disease, that had a direct and serious clinical implication. Cardivex, the drug about to be approved for general use in hypertension patients, showed in the real data a signal of elevated cardiovascular risk in patients with prior coronary artery disease, a signal that had been systematically eliminated from the official data. Patients with coronary artery disease who were going to take Cardivex because their doctors, based on the approved data, were going to consider it safe for them. Patients who could die because someone had decided that 16 adverse events were a problem that could be solved by deleting them. I did not sleep that night, not from panic, from the kind of insomnia that comes when your brain cannot turn off because it is processing something with too many implications to fit in normal thinking hours. At 3 in the morning, I made the decision. Before reporting anything internally, before making any move that could be visible, I needed to have the evidence in a place that was not the company's systems. I went to the laboratory at 6 in the morning when there was still no one there. I printed every relevant document, the clinical center data, the records of the 16 individual cases, the official trial database with the discrepancies marked, the statistical analysis showing the concentration in the coronary artery disease subgroup, the internal emails from the data management team over the previous 6 months that I had access to as a team member, several of which, when I read them with the eyes of someone who already knew what they were looking for, had phrases that, in that context, meant very different things from what they appear to mean in a normal reading. I photographed every screen with my personal phone. I copied everything I could copy onto a USB drive that I put in my bag. And before the first colleague arrived that morning, I left the building with a physical file in my briefcase. I kept copies in 3 places: my apartment, a bank's safe deposit box, and with my sister in another city. I reported internally that same day, not to my department director, to the company's medical director, who in Pharmavint's hierarchy was the highest authority responsible for scientific integrity, and the official to whom reports of irregularities in clinical trials had to be presented according to the company's own internal protocol. I met with him for 1 hour. I presented the analysis of the discrepancies. I showed him the 16 cases. I explained the concentration in the coronary artery disease subgroup and its clinical implications. The medical director listened to me with an expression that over time I have learned to recognize as the expression of someone who already knows what they're being told, but is evaluating how much the person telling them knows. He told me that what I was describing required careful internal verification, that he asked for absolute confidentiality while it was being reviewed, that he trusted my scientific judgment and would take the matter with the seriousness it deserved. I left that meeting with the feeling that something had changed. I did not know exactly what until 2 days later. 2 days later, I tried to access the trial data management system to continue my work. My user had no access. I called the systems department. They told me there was no active user with my name in the system. I went to human resources. They told me there was no active employee with my ID number. I went to my desk. My things were not there. The desk had been assigned to someone else. Nobody on the floor was looking at me directly. They had erased me, not formally dismissed, not with a letter or a process. Simply erased from the system as if the 3 years I had worked in that building had not existed. It is the corporate version of institutional erasure, and it is a tactic the industry knows about even if it rarely names it, making a person disappear from the records before there is a formal process that protects them. I left the building. I called my attorney from the parking lot, and I told her to start. My attorney is Attorney Carmen Aguirre. She has spent 14 years specializing in pharmaceutical and regulatory law with specific cases before the FDA and the EMA. When I described the situation over the phone, she asked me to come to her office in 2 hours. I arrived with the briefcase. She reviewed the documentation for 3 hours. When she looked up, she told me that what I had was extraordinary from an evidentiary standpoint and terrifying from a public health standpoint. That the combination of the documented statistical discrepancies with the concentration in the coronary artery disease subgroup and the internal emails suggesting prior knowledge of the situation configured a case of regulatory fraud with potentially serious consequences for future patients. She told me we needed to act simultaneously on several fronts because the Cardivex approval process was at an advanced stage, and every day that passed brought closer the moment when the drug could be approved with fraudulent data. Speed was critical. What we did in the following 72 hours was the most intense work of my professional career. We filed a formal complaint with COFEPRIS in Mexico, which was the most relevant national regulatory body given that Pharmavence had primary operations in the country. The complaint included the complete file with the documented discrepancies, the coronary artery disease subgroup analysis, and an urgent request for precautionary suspension of the Cardivex approval process while it was investigated. We simultaneously sent notifications to the FDA and EMA, given that Pharmavence had parallel approval applications in process in the United States and Europe. My attorney contacted an international organization for the protection of scientific research integrity that has specific protocols for receiving clinical trial fraud complaints and that has recognized technical credibility before regulatory bodies. And I contacted two independent scientists, one at a university in the United States and another at a European institution, who had published research on clinical trial methodology and to whom I sent the anonymized data to obtain independent technical validation on my statistical analysis. Both responded in less than 48 hours, confirming that the discrepancies I had identified could not be explained as random errors and that the concentration in the coronary artery disease subgroup was statistically significant. COFEPRIS responded in 4 days. It issued a precautionary suspension of the Cardivex approval process and ordered an emergency audit of the clinical trial data with direct access to the records of the participating clinical centers. The FDA and EMA, notified by COFEPRIS through international regulatory cooperation channels, initiated their own review processes. Pharmavence was notified of the simultaneous investigations. What happened inside the company's facilities in the following days was described to me afterward by a colleague who was still working there. It was the kind of accelerated movement of people and documents that happens when an organization understands that the time it has to control the damage is very short. It was not enough. The original data from the clinical centers, which are independent of Pharmavence internal systems and which the center investigators were obligated to preserve, were intact and confirmed exactly what I had documented. The emergency audit confirmed the existence of the 16 discrepancies and found 9 additional ones I had not been able to identify from my position. 25 serious adverse events eliminated from the official data, all going in the same direction, all concentrated in the same subgroup. The approval of Cardivex was suspended indefinitely. COFEPRIS initiated a sanctions process against Pharmavence for fraud in the presentation of regulatory data that in Mexico can result in the cancellation of health registrations for all of the company's products. The FDA and EMA initiated reviews of all other Pharmavence products with current approvals in their jurisdictions. The medical director who had received me and who clearly knew more than he had admitted in that meeting, was identified as the primary responsible party for the data manipulation and was personally charged. 3 members of the data management team were also charged. My employment situation was resolved relatively quickly. The institutional erasure they had attempted on me, not having been preceded by any formal termination process, left them in a very weak legal position. My attorney filed the unjustified dismissal and documented retaliation lawsuit with the system access records before and after my meeting with the medical director as evidence of the timing of the actions against me. The compensation was negotiated and resolved in 8 weeks. What mattered more to me than the compensation was this. My name remained in the records of the regulatory investigation as the person who had identified and reported the irregularities. That means that in the public history of the case, which is a permanent document in the archives of the regulatory bodies, my contribution is documented. Nobody can erase that, not even if they... I found work 10 months later, an independent clinical research integrity monitoring organization. It is the work that makes most sense after everything I lived through. I work reviewing clinical trial data, looking for exactly the kind of irregularities I found at Pharmavence. Work that exists because regulatory bodies know that data manipulation in clinical trials occurs and that they need people who know how to detect it. Cardivex never reached the market. The patients with coronary artery disease who would have taken that drug based on data that put them at risk without their knowledge do not know there is a person who spent a night awake until 3 in the morning and several weeks of her life, so that would not happen. They do not need to know, but I do know, and it is enough. What I want you to take from this story is not only the indignation. It is the awareness that the medications you take reached you through an approval process that depends on the data supporting it being honest. That process has people inside the system whose job is to guarantee that honesty. And when those people find that honesty has been compromised, they have tools to act. Regulatory bodies, complaint protocols, scientific integrity organizations, whistleblower protection laws. The system is not perfect, but it has people. And people, when they act with evidence and rigor, can stop things that would otherwise not be stopped. That is worth remembering. If this story chilled you to the bone, comment. Do you blindly trust approved medications? Like if you believe integrity in clinical trials is non-negotiable. Subscribe for more real stories. Share with someone who works in the pharmaceutical or health sector and needs to know there are protocols for reporting these kinds of irregularities. Practical tip. If you work in the pharmaceutical industry or in clinical research and find data irregularities, there are formal complaint channels with the FDA, EMA, COFEPRIS, and other regulatory bodies that have whistleblower protection protocols. Document before reporting internally. The original data from clinical centers is independent of internal company systems and is the most solid evidence.